All right, the last video I want to talk about is factoring out the GCF. The last video for this week, before we get into it, I would like to explain what the GCF means. Now, we all know what it stands for. It's the greatest common factor. But what does that mean? What is the greatest common factor? So it is the greatest or the biggest. It has to be common, meaning it has to be the same for every single number. And it has to be a factor, meaning it divides into something evenly. So we're looking for the biggest number, and it has to be a factor, which means it divides into everything evenly. And it has to be common, meaning it has to be the same for every number. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's look at 6x plus 36. Now, what I'm trying to figure out is what is the greatest number that I can divide, which means it's going to be a factor. It has to divide into 6 and 36, and there's the common part. So common because it's 6 and 36 are both divisible by it. So if you think, what can I divide 6 and 36 by? That is the absolute biggest number I can divide by. So pause the video and think about that. What can I divide 6 and 36 by? That is the biggest. Okay, so hopefully you found that the number is 6. I can divide 6 by 6, and I can divide 6 by 36. 36 by 6. And so what we do is we put the GCF out here, and then we're going to have some stuff in the parentheses, and I call this the leftovers. Or it's the leftovers after you divide both of these terms by 6. After I divide that by 6 and that by 6, I'm going to have some leftovers. Okay, so we're going to put the GCF out here as a 6. Then we're going to take this and divide it by 6, which would become 1x, because 6 divided by 6 is 1. And then we're going to take the 36 and divide it by 6, and that is going to be 6. And so if I factor out the GCF between those two numbers, it's going to look like this. 6, and then in parentheses, x plus 6. And that is the GCF is 6. That's what this number tells us. And this is what's left over. Now, something to keep in mind is if I distribute this 6 back through, I will get 6x plus 36, which is exactly where I started this problem. That should always happen. You should always, if you distribute your GCF back through the parentheses, you should get back to where you started. A good way to check your answer if you ever get to that point. Here's a couple more examples. So again, I'm looking at these two numbers right here, and I'm going to say, can I divide the 3 and the 24 by something? Okay, and the answer is yes. I can divide them both by 3. And if I divide this by 3, that 3 basically turns into a 1, or it's just an x. And then this 24 divides by 3 and becomes a minus 8. And that's all there is to it. That's factoring out the GCF. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing over here on this one. Instead, we now have to think of all three numbers. And what are all three numbers divisible by? Because it has to be common, meaning it has to be the same for all three numbers. Okay. Now, if you look at those three numbers, hopefully you've kind of figured it out, and it's actually also a 3. If I divide this by 3, I get 1x squared. If I divide this by 3, I get 2x. And if I divide this by 3, I get minus 6. And that's it. That's my GCF. I don't have to write that 1 if I don't want to. I can just write it like that. And that would be my final answer for factoring out the GCF. Okay, now let's get a little bit harder. Something like this. Okay. Now on this, notice that all of them have at least 1x. Okay. So that's also going to be part of my GCF. So I'm going to have an x here as part of my GCF outside the parentheses. Okay. Now I'm going to look at the 8, the 12, and the 48 and think, what is the greatest number that I can divide into all three of those evenly. Okay? And so I'd like you to pause the video again and see if you can figure that out. All right, hopefully you've got it figured out, but let's see here. The answer should be 4. I can divide 8 by 4, 12 by 4, and 48 by 4. Okay, now I want to figure out what are the leftovers. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to divide this 8 by 4, and that leaves us with 2. And if the x is part of my GCF, it's almost like I'm going to take an x away from each one of these. Take an x away from x cubed, take an x away from x squared, and take an x away from the 48. It's going to basically reduce all the powers by 1. So instead of x cubed, it's going to be x squared because I took one of them away. And if I divide this by 4, I'll get 3, take one of the x's away, and I just have x. I think I'm out of room here. And then minus, if I divide 48 by 4, I'll get 12. If I take that x away, it's just gone. And there is my factored form factoring out the GCF. Okay? Now, on the con practices, they also talk about an area model. And the area model is just a way to organize the information. So this is how the problem starts, 4x plus 8. They create 2 boxes, one for each term. They put the 4x in one and they put the 8 in the other. All right? They actually also tell you that the GCF is 4 in the con practice. Excuse me. What you have to do is figure out the width. They call this the width of the rectangle. And so basically you're just trying to figure out what are the leftovers. All right, so this is your GCF and this is your 4x. So if I divide this 4x by 4, I'll just have 1x. And if I divide this 8 by 4, I'll have 2. So in the con practice, they're looking for this as the answer. I would recommend not putting the 1 in. I would just put x plus 2 in as the width. The con practices I've been learning have been very finicky about how you put your answers in. And so I would just ignore the 1 and put x plus 2 in. But just know in the con practice, they're looking for this answer right here, the x plus 2, not anything else. Okay, let's do another one. I did notice one on the con practice that had 3 terms. And again, they tell you that the GCF is 5. Okay, and so basically we're just going to divide all 3 of these numbers by 5 and then put them up here as my leftovers. So we're going to take 10 and divide it by 5, and that will give me 2x squared. Then we're going to take the negative 5 and divide it by 5. That will give me negative x. Remember, there is a 1 there, but because con is a little bit picky on how they want the answers to be written, I would recommend not putting that there. And then the last thing we're going to do is divide this 25 by 5, and that would give me plus 5. Okay, so what they're looking for is they're looking for this as your answer, that stuff that goes in the parentheses. Okay, so that's the area model that they are looking at on the con practices. I just want to make this video to make sure you guys understood that, and also just to give you a quick intro on factoring out the GCF. If you guys have any questions, always email me. Jump on my office hours as well, but good luck.